received a doctoral degree in history from the University of Münster with a book on ceremonial rank and social order in early modern city on the case of Leipzig. Since 28, he has been a member of the academic staff at the Leibniz Institute of European History in Mainz. He dedicated his habilitation thesis on the problem of unequal partners, the Spanish monarchy, and the Hanseatic cities 1570 to 1700. Most recently, he was a substitute professor at the University of Erlangen. He speaks today about agents of change and go-betweens, transatlantic mobility and social change in colonial Latin America. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andreas, for this kind introduction. First of all, I wish to thank the organizers of this conference for their kind invitation and for giving me the possibility to present part of my ongoing research at this conference. Well, I think it is definitely worthwhile to discuss the importance of momentum of its own, whatever that means, within the Latin American context, although I have to admit that I feel a little bit uncomfortable with the term pre-modern Latin America. Not only because post-colonial theory has questioned the paradigm of Western modernity, and among global historians there is an ongoing debate whether there were multiple modernities. In the case of Latin America, the term pre-modern seems inappropriate to me for yet another reason. From my point of view, it overstresses the continuities and similarities between pre-Columbian civilizations and what came after. Whether or not Columbus' first voyage marked the beginning of early modernity, as could be argued, it definitely was a watershed for the inhabitants of the New World. The European discovery of America and the subsequent conquest of the newly discovered lands led to a dramatic and irreversible demographic and social change. The colonial societies that were shaped by transatlantic mobility. From the beginning, Spanish authorities tried to regulate and to control this mobility. The Spanish crown and its newly created administrative institutions, Seville's House of Trade, the Casa de Contratación, and the Council of the Indies, El Consejo de Indias, had clear ideas of how a well-ordered colonial society should look like and who should therefore be allowed or not allowed to travel to the Indies. Behind these efforts to control and regulate transatlantic mobility and migration, there was the constant fear that the distant territories on the other side of the Atlantic would fall away from the crown as a consequence of rebellion, the intervention of other European powers, the infiltration with dangerous religious ideas, or because the conquistadors who had taken possession of the newly discovered lands in the name of the Spanish crown would try to establish independent rule. All these fears were only too well founded, as became apparent in the course of the 16th century. Notwithstanding, colonial rule in Spanish America lasted more than 3 centuries. If we look for an explanation, we can possibly find it in the way colonial society came to terms with mobility and social change. So what I'm going to present in the following is part of an ongoing project on mobility and belonging in the Iberian Atlantic. This project analyzes the connection between mobility and the construction of identities and cultural affiliations from an actor-centered perspective. Today, I want to shift the focus from the mobile actors and their construction of identities and belonging to the societies confronted with mobility. As I'm going to argue, transatlantic mobility gained a momentum of its own and had a strong effect on the formation and transformation of colonial society without, however, questioning colonial rule. In the following, I'm going to have a look at 2 exemplary lives in the early modern Iberian Atlantic. Parting from these 2 case studies, I will finally draw some general conclusions on the relation between mobility, social change, and momentum of its own. So this leads me to my first point, my first case study, Afro-Amerindian communities and the limits of colonial rule, Francisco de Arobe. If you have ever been to Madrid's Museo de América, you may have noticed this remarkable painting from 1599 by Andrés Sánchez Galque. The painting is not only outstanding because of the painter's remarkable artistic skills. Galque was a native of Quito, the capital of present-day Ecuador, and had Hispanized his Quechua surname, possibly Sangolqui. So what is even more remarkable than the artistic skills of the painter of this masterpiece are the portrait persons and the way they are captured. The man in the middle is Francisco de Arobe, a man of 56 years, as the inscription on the top says. The two younger men on Francisco's left and right are his two sons, Pedro, aged 22, and Domingo, aged 18. As we can guess from the color of their skin, all of them had African roots. The man's ears, nose, and lips are pierced and studded with gold ornaments of pre-colonial origin. Most probably these artifacts came from the so-called La Tolita culture in the coastal region of present-day Ecuador, close to the Colombian border. In their right hands, they carry iron-tipped lances, and around their necks we can distinguish large shell collars, typical and popular among the indigenous peoples of the Pacific coast of the Audiencia de Quito. Their clothing consists of a strange mixture of Spanish Renaissance fashion, white ruffs, fitted doublets, capes of brocaded silk, and indigenous elements, colorful ponchos cut in an Andean style, but apparently made of Chinese silk. What calls the viewer's attention is not only the strange mixture of styles and elements of diverse origin, but also the quality of their clothing and ornaments. The way the three men are dressed and portrayed is all the more surprising, having in mind, and we've already heard that in most parts of the Spanish Empire, Afro-Americans and their descendants occupied the lowest ranks of society. If they are captured at all, they are usually not portrayed in that manner. And what is more, all the three names, if you look closely, bear the honorable title Don. The story behind this stunning painting is not less stunning and tells us a lot about transatlantic mobility and social change in a remote part of the Spanish Empire. Don Francisco de Arobe, the man in the middle, probably was born around 1560. According to the painting, he was 56 years old when he was portrayed, but he must have been born after 1545. In that year, Francisco's father, Andrés Mangache, an enslaved African, escaped from a ship that stranded on the coast of Esmeraldas, an untamed province of the lowland Pacific fringe of the Audiencia of Quito. I have a small map here, so there you can see Esmeraldas, just to give you an idea. Together with other fugitive slaves, among them his Nicaraguan female companion who had been enslaved during the Spanish conquest of Central America, Andrés Mangache escaped to the interior, where he managed to ally with the local indigenous people and later became head of their community. Andrés and his Nicaraguan wife had two sons, Francisco and Juan, that does not appear on the painting, who succeeded their father as heads of this indigenous community. Since the 1580s at the latest, the two brothers were in direct contact with Spanish authorities. As early as in 1550, the Viceroy of Peru and the Audiencia de Quito had begun to commission military expeditions, so-called entradas, that should pacify the untamed province of Esmeraldas and reduce its inhabitants to Spanish rule. Actually, all these entradas failed. Like other leaders of Afro-Amerindian communities in the region, and there were various, the Arobes and their clan applied a confusing blend of tactics to keep intruders at bay. First, they received the Spaniards, very friendly, supplied them with food, offered assistance against other indigenous communities, hinted to unexploited treasures in the mangrove forest, who never could be found, and promised future submission to the Spanish crown. Then they disappeared from one day to the next without previous announcement and retreated to the interior where the Spaniards could not find them. In the 1580s, however, the negotiations with the Arobe brothers seemed to advance. In 1586, Juan Arobe repeatedly traveled to Quito, where he received rich gifts from Rodrigo de Rivadeneira, a wealthy merchant who hoped to establish a colony of Spanish settlers in Esmeraldas. 3 years later, the Arobes placed their community under the religious instruction of a Mercedarian friar and established a church in the newly founded village of San Mateo, which they further populated in the 1590s. At that time, they also gained reputation for assisting castaways on the nearby coast. In 1596, a new royal judge was appointed to the Audiencia of Quito who had far-reaching plans for the region. Dr. Juan Barrio de Sepúlveda, who had already gathered experience with runaway slaves and indigenous resistance in Panama, hoped to solve the maroon problem on Quito's Pacific coast by applying a new strategy. Instead of commissioning military operations, Barrio de Sepúlveda fostered Christian mission in the region and tried to negotiate alliances with local community leaders. And in this context, Francisco de Arobe came to Quito in 1590, accompanied by 2 of his sons, to pledge his loyalty to the crown. On this occasion, Barrio de Sepúlveda commissioned. So it was Barrio de Sepúlveda who commissioned that painting to later send it to King Philip III as a proof of the successful pacification of this remote province of Esmeraldas. For the Audiencia and also for the Viceroy in Lima and the Consejo de Indias, this remote province, densely covered by tropical rainforests and difficult to access, gained importance at that time, among other factors, because of English pirates operating on the Pacific coast. In 1594, Richard Hawkins, for instance, was captured after a battle with 2 Spanish ships at San Mateo Bay, precisely in that regions. And by reassuring the loyalty of indigenous community leaders in the region, the Spanish crown hoped to prevent the latter from forming alliances with foreign powers or with pirates. In this sense, Barrio de Sepúlveda's initiative was quite successful. On closer inspection, however, the outcome of the negotiations were as ambiguous as the portrait of Francisco de Arobe and his sons, which was later sent to Madrid, accompanied by an enthusiastic letter written by Juan Barrio Sepúlveda, in which he praised its advances in taming the province of Esmeraldas. Andrés Sánchez Galque's painting leaves ample room for interpretation, actually. To what extent did the 3 portrait men really accept Spanish overrule? Do their lances really express their willingness to defend the domains of His Catholic Majesty against all foes, as Barrio Sepúlveda has it, or were they rather symbols of their autonomy as local rulers? Does their dress betray their Hispanization, or is it rather an expression of cultural hybridity? In any case, their example shows that in distant regions of the Spanish Empire, fugitive slaves and their descendants could maintain a considerable scope of action. Although Francisco de Arobe and his people officially accepted Spanish overrule, colonial authorities treated them respectfully, gave them generous gifts, and, what is more important even, confirmed their authority and status as local leaders, as caciques. During the whole colonial period, the province of Esmeraldas preserved a considerable degree of autonomy, among other factors because Barrio Sepúlveda's and Rivadeneira's far-reaching plans were never realized. It was only in the 20th century that the port of Esmeraldas gained importance and Rivadeneira's plan to build a direct land connection between Quito and Esmeraldas was not realized until the 1990s. Today, the Green Province, with its huge Afro-American population, is one of the poorest regions of a poor country of Ecuador, and Afro-Ecuadorians still suffer discrimination on all levels of social life. In the 16th century, however, people like Francisco de Arobe managed to resist colonial exploitation to quite an extent and save their communities from the atrocities of Spanish conquest. We do not know what qualified Francisco's father and other fugitive slaves to become caciques, to become leader of indigenous communities. Another interesting question, because I've already pointed out, in Spanish colonial cities, these black Africans, these enslaved Africans, usually occupy the lowest rank of society. In this case, obviously the highest ranks. Maybe language skills and experience in dealing with Spanish authorities played a role. According to the records, Francisco and his brother Juan already spoke some Spanish when they first came into contact with Spanish soldiers and missionaries. Probably they had learned it from their parents. Francisco's father, Andrés Mangache, had crossed the Atlantic Ocean and the Central American mainland before arriving at the Pacific coast. Francisco and his sons never traveled that far. Unlike their portraits, they never crossed the Atlantic themselves. However, among 16th century transatlantic travelers were not only native Spaniards and enslaved Africans, but also indigenous Americans and so-called mestizos, a fact that has been widely overlooked by historians for quite a long time. So this leads me to my second example, a life between two worlds, Diego de Torres y Moyachoque. Diego de Torres y Moyachoque was born in Tunja in what is now central Colombia in 1549. Diego's father, Juan de Torres, came to South America in the 1530s, but unlike Francisco de Arobe's father, he was not forced to cross the ocean as an enslaved person. Like many other Spanish conquistadors, he came to the Indies in search for riches and fortune. Between 1537 and 1540, Juan de Torres participated in the conquest of the new kingdom of Granada under Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada. After the military campaign, he was compensated for his merits with a rich encomienda, and like many other Spaniards, he took a native woman as a wife, although he was already married in Spain. This occurred quite often. Catalina de Moyachoque, Juan's second wife and Diego's mother, belonged to the ruling elite of the Muisca or Chibcha, who inhabited the Altiplano Cundi-Boyacense north of Bogota, the capital of present-day Colombia. So on this map you can see the territories of the Muisca people. Catalina was the sister of a Muisca cacique, and according to the matrilineal succession rules among the Muisca, her eldest son Diego would inherit the cacicazgo of Turmeque from his uncle. In conformance with this rule, the indigenous community of Turmeque recognized him as their cacique in 1571 when his uncle died, and Diego's claims to the cacicazgo were later confirmed by the Audiencia of Santa Fe de Bogotá. In the meantime, Diego's half-brother, Pedro, born in Spain in 1532, had come to Nueva Granada to assist his father with the administration of his estates. Pedro was the only son of Juan de Torres and his first Spanish wife, Leonor Ruiz Herrezuelos. In 1570, when Juan de Torres died, Pedro inherited his father's encomienda, which also encompassed the villages of Turmeque and his native inhabitants, whose cacique would become Diego 1 year later. You already can guess what will happen. In 1574, a conflict between the two half-brothers arose, in the course of which Pedro managed to depose Diego from his cacicazgo. In 1574, the Audiencia de Santa Fe decided that Diego had to leave Turmeque and ordered his huts and enclosures to be destroyed. Diego protested against this sentence and finally wrote a letter of complaint to King Philip II, asking for a license to travel to Spain, where he wanted to present his cause before the Council of the Indies. This license arrived in New Granada 2 years later. At that point in time, Diego had already left the region, evading a warrant for his arrest that the Real Audiencia of Santa Fe had issued in the meantime, and had already made his way to the Iberian Peninsula. On his journey, he got shipwrecked in Hispaniola, where he found many villages abandoned because the inhabitants had died from hard work and diseases. Diego was shocked, foreseeing that the people of his homeland would suffer the same fate in the future. At the court in Madrid, he not only demanded his reinstatement as cacique, but also denounced the mistreatment of the indigenous population by the Spanish encomenderos, among them his half-brother Pedro. Whereas Diego could not get his claims recognized by the Audiencia of Santa Fe, his arguments convinced the Council of the Indies and the Spanish king. In 1578, Philip II reversed the decision of the Audiencia of Santa Fe and ordered that Diego should be restored in his office. In 1579, the cacique of Turmeque returned to his homeland, accompanied by Juan Bautista Monzón, a visitador, who should investigate the charges against the encomenderos. However, Monzón's mission neither brought the hope for reform of the encomienda system in the region, nor did it improve the situation of the Muisca. The visitador soon turned the Audiencia and the archbishop against him and finally ended up in prison, together with Diego, who was accused of plotting an armed rebellion among the Indios of Turmeque. Awaiting his execution, Diego managed to escape from prison with the help of his friends and hid in the mountains until the arrival of a new visitador, Juan Prieto de Orellana, who reached Santa Fe in 1581. Orellana found all the accusations against the encomenderos justified and ordered them to cease their violence and abuses against the native population. Under these changed circumstances, Diego decided to surrender and was sent to Spain again, where the Council of the Indies should decide on his case. Back in Madrid, Diego continued campaigning for his restoration as cacique and the cause of the indigenous peoples of the region. In 1584, he submitted to King Philip II a lengthy list of crimes, abuses, and cruelties committed against the local population. This memorial of grievances, or Memorial de Agravios, was accompanied by 2 detailed maps of the region that Diego had drawn while he was hiding in the mountains. These maps, the first known plans of the region, not only contain valuable information on indigenous villages and towns who would otherwise have been lost to history, they also bear witness to the demographic catastrophe caused by Spanish conquest. At the bottom of the plan, Diego noted, "By this river, El Rio de Magdalena, there was an infinity of Indios. All of them have been consumed by the cruel labors, so that more than 50,000 Indios no longer remain." In Madrid, Diego was finally acquitted of all charges, but not allowed to return to his homeland. He spent the rest of his life in the Spanish capital, where he married a Spanish woman named Juana de Oropesa, with whom he had 3 children. In one of his last appeals to the king, Diego lamented his difficult situation. Since arriving at the court, he and his family had been completely dependent on royal grants for their survival and suffered severe hardship. Without these grants, Diego did not know what to do, for it was such a long time, and I quote, he had been away from his land and Cacicasco, suffering. 4 months later, on April 4, 1519, he died in Madrid at the age of only 41. The fate of his wife and children is unknown. In his relatively short life, Diego had crossed the Atlantic 3 times, and he would have made a 4th voyage if he had been given permission and his finances had allowed it. Although the Council of the Indies acquitted him from the charge of rebellion, the royal councillors did not want him to return to his homeland. Their refusal to grant him a travel license probably had to do with Diego's biography and his ambiguous status as a mestizo. Like so many other conquistadors, Diego's father had taken an indigenous noblewoman as a wife. We've already heard of similar cases. On the one hand, the connubium with women from the former indigenous ruling elite was a widespread and quite effective strategy, so to say, to secure Spanish rule over the newly conquered lands. On the other hand, royal authorities viewed these mixed marriages with skepticism and preferred Spanish colonizers to marry Spanish women. Therefore, the Council of the Indies tried to promote female migration to the Indies and obliged male migrants to bring their wife and children to the Indies. Bachelors could not stay in the Indies longer than 2 or 3 years without marrying, at least in theory. Despite of all these measures, migration, 16th century migration to the Indies was predominantly male, and mixed marriages were quite frequent. The children born to mixed couples, the so-called mestizos, always had an ambivalent status and were frequently seen as a potential threat for colonial order. Diego de Torres y Moyachoc is a perfect example of this phenomenon. Diego was in many respects highly privileged. We already heard about taxation privileges, but at the same time confronted with mistrust and discrimination. He was educated at a special school for mestizo children and later at the Dominican convent in Tunja, where he not only received lessons in grammar, religion, moral, and law, but was also trained in horse riding, archery, and jousting. Thus, Diego was highly literate, fluent in both Spanish and Muisca, and also trained in the skills and virtues of a Spanish nobleman. It were precisely these qualities that made him a perfect leader of his community and a fervent and eloquent advocate of indigenous rights, and at the same time a potentially dangerous and highly suspicious object in the eyes of the encomenderos and the criollo elite of Santa Fe. When his half-brother Pedro tried to depose Diego from his cacicazgo, he relied on the widespread prejudices held against mestizos, blaming his half-brother to be a mestizo in the dress of an Indio. Diego's ambiguous persona is still evident in present-day memory culture, whereas a sculpture on Turmeque's central place shows him as an indigenous leader in a heroic pose, riding a horse and holding his memorial of grievances in his right hand. On the municipal coat of arms, he appears as a Spanish man of letters. Behind the 16th century conflict between the two half-brothers, we can observe two different systems of colonial rule clashing with each other, and one could add also two different systems of estate-based hierarchies. On the one hand, the cacicazgo, which implied the inherited rule of indigenous communities, often approved and confirmed by Spanish authorities, and on the other hand, the encomienda, introduced by the Spanish crown to satisfy the conquistadors' demands for compensation. At the same time, however, the conflict was also a struggle over the place of mestizos within colonial society. In the case of Diego de Torres, this conflict was finally solved by removing an inconvenient actor from the scene. And this leads me to my concluding remarks: transatlantic mobility, social change, and momentum of its own. In the long run, Spanish authorities' efforts to control transatlantic mobility did not have the desired effect. The societies and polities that arose on the other side of the Atlantic as a result of transatlantic mobility became much more mixed and culturally hybrid than Spanish authorities wished for. Nevertheless, what we might call momentum of its own led to social change, but never questioned colonial rule. Whereas most enslaved Africans who were forced to cross the Atlantic in the 16th century had to live and work in miserable conditions and suffered violence and mistreatment of all kinds, a considerable number of enslaved persons managed to free themselves from slavery and to form independent communities, usually situated in remote parts of the Spanish Empire, far from the colonial centers and difficult to access. As the example of Francisco de Arobe shows, in these regions, so-called Maroons and indigenous people had a considerable scope of action and could preserve a relatively high degree of autonomy throughout the whole colonial period. This autonomy was negotiated with Spanish authorities who confirmed and acknowledged the rights of local rulers, while the latter accepted Spanish overrule. However, the pact between local caciques like Francisco de Aroba and royal authorities was highly ambiguous and left ample room for interpretation and maneuver on both sides. And I would argue that it was precisely that ambiguity that guaranteed consensus, if you want, and the perseverance of colonial rule for more than 3 centuries. So this could be actually a case in point of consensus-oriented culture. But I would add definitely, if you talk about 3 elements, this one being the third, I would add ambiguity or ambiguity tolerance, maybe as a 4th category, which is, from my point of view, very characteristic for Ancien Regime societies, both in the colonial context and in Ancien Regime Europe. In other areas where the Spanish presence was stronger, indigenous peoples had more difficulties to maintain their liberty and relative autonomy. The encomienda system was a heavy burden for the indigenous population of the Andean highland region of present-day Colombia, for instance, who were subjected to forced labor and often mistreated by the encomenderos. Nevertheless, even in those regions where the encomienda was successfully introduced, colonial rule relied to quite an extent on the cooperation of indigenous elites. Indigenous caciques served as brokers and go-betweens, and if they were prepared and willing to advocate for their people, they were sometimes even able to save them from the excesses and atrocities of the encomienda. However, the status of these caciques was always ambivalent, especially if they were mestizos, as the example of Diego de Torres shows. And what we can observe here is, in my eyes, well, maybe a clash of 2 different systems of estate-based hierarchy that merged in a way, but this also caused conflict, as we have seen. While Diego was highly appreciated by the indigenous people of the region, who obviously regarded him as one of their kind, he set the criollo elite against him, who generally held strong prejudices against mestizos. That Diego's claims finally got recognized by the Council of the Indies and the king was not uncommon. What is interesting in this case is, and in many other cases, that to promote his cause, Diego had to appear personally at the court. Presence culture. But the long distance between colonial Latin America and the Spanish metropolis was a challenge for a polity based on present culture. Crossing the ocean was costly, risky, and required a royal permission, at least in theory. And although Diego managed to cross the Atlantic 3 times, he finally got stuck in Madrid. So this is yet another aspect, actually, of transatlantic mobility. Colonial rule of a new world was, as I've pointed out, always distant rule and a challenge for presence culture. This could be an advantage for local actors. We have already heard of se obedece pero no se cumple. So the king was really far away, and it was quite easy to practice no se obedece, no se cumple. But it also could prove disadvantages, as Diego's case shows. Although the migration regimes established by the Spanish crown were never as effective as royal authorities wished for, allowing or preventing a person from traveling to America could be an effective means of suffocating protests, conflicts, and enforcing colonial rule. Diego got his right, but he was never able to make use of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, for your slides of the paper. And there's time enough for questions again. Maybe first, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Thomas. I really love the ambiguity tolerance, and I think we need a little bit more of that nowadays. I'm not sure if this is like another facet, maybe, of the consensus orientation, but I think it's important to take into mind. And I also loved both of your case studies with regard to the first one. Maybe I didn't get it right. Are you sure he was really the cacique of an indigenous community? Because in the Esmeralda regions, there are also mulatto communities in their organization. But then maybe I really did not hear it well enough. Because I also thought about other studies in Mexico where there were also Afro-descendant communities with their own organization, who resembled the indigenous ones. And a very small question, Juana de Oropesa, did this have something to do with the Marquesado de Oropesa near Cusco? Or is it just the same name?
I guess it's just the same name. As far as I know, it's just the same name. To answer this last question. Well, the first one, could we maybe skip again to the painting? No, in this case, there were Afro-American communities as well, but in this case, it was really an indigenous community. And if you have a look at the portraits, if you apply the taxonomy of the age, they would be called Sambos, no mulattoes. So Francisco's father was an enslaved African, and his mother was indigenous, but not from the region, but from Nicaragua. So this is really a mixed couple in many various regards, actually. And they are the offspring of this couple. There was another question.
No. Of a comment.
Okay. Exactly. I would argue that consensus culture often implies ambiguity. So in many cases, we could also maybe speak of consensus facades. So there was an outward consensus, and everybody apparently agreed to this consensus, but this consensus left ample room for differences, which were not expressed.
Richard.
Yeah, thanks very much also for the really interesting talk. I thought also found it really, was kind of important points that you were mentioning here about women, about the migration of Spanish women, which really, as you were talking about, in the 16th century, maybe much less, and then more women from Europe coming in towards the 17th century, and how that maybe had impacts on these societies. Because I think also, kind of the questions around gender is also something maybe that's really quite important here we're talking here about these different forms of society, but what are different roles of gender here for these different groups or different traditions that we're discussing. And so for me, it's maybe a bit more of a more detailed question, but connected to this, you mentioned also this your case with Diego de Torres and connection to matrilineal descent in his family, connected to that. So I was really interested in that, or maybe if you can expand a little on that. It's for me, from my own research, it really reminded me of some cases again with from colonial Mexico, and for me, for example, that I mentioned a bit yesterday, some cases I studied with Fernando de Alves de Xochitl, the 17th century, and so in his family, just briefly here, also they ruled then over this Caticasco in San Juan Teotihuacan, this indigenous community, and it was often, for some generations, there were cacicas, so we do have quite a few other cases also. Female cacicas, it's quite an interesting phenomenon. But then, like towards the mid 17th century, there would be men who had this Caticasco. We have kind of this shift going on, maybe a shift in some cases from the more matrilineal, pre-Hispanic matrilineal descent forms to more patrilineal approach from Europe. And in this case, at least, there are many different.
Yeah,
so yeah, just wondering maybe about matrilineal descent from your case studies.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard. I think this is a great question and definitely an aspect we should discuss, because we're talking always about state-based hierarchies, but what's the place of gender within these hierarchies? And of course, there were very different concepts of marriage, differences regarding succession rules, etc., which had to, in a way, to be reconciled or to be merged in this context. And this produced conflicts too. In this particular case, well, I'm not an expert on Muska culture, I'm not an ethnologist, and I only can repeat what I have read in the literature. But if I got this right, it's with the Muska, the cacique normally is a male person. But the next cacique is not the eldest son of the cacique, but the eldest son of his eldest sister. So a rather complex system of succession, which was applied also in this case. And as you can imagine, of course, Pedro tried to argue also with the question of illegitimacy. Wow, terrible. My English gets always worse. Yeah, this could be a problem, because these relationships between Spaniards and native women were not always considered as legitimate. And the same holds true for the sons and daughters of these mixed marriages. And in this case, he already was married in Spain. So according to canon law, this was really a severe sin and a crime. He couldn't marry another woman officially. But there are many, many cases, and well, you all know the case of Martin Cortés, for instance, where these conquistadors later managed to get even a papal license to legitimize their offspring. Yeah, but this is an important point, I think, and I'm not able to answer this in a general way, and I don't know how this developed in the 17th or 18th century. Probably this changed in that region too, but I can't answer your question.
Okay, Franz?
First of all, thank you very much for that brilliant talk. That was really inspiring. Referring to the clashes of hierarchies you just mentioned, I mean, you've been raised in Münster, so to speak, like I have.
Yes.
How
are you?
The question is there that clashes of hierarchies are commonplace in Europe too.
Yeah.
So if you don't put the stamp colonialism on it, you find the same. Of course, it's different in the way it's spelled out. No? And of course, but what you have here, like different attitudes towards hierarchy, somebody has to decide the case, and guess what? It's a king. It's a European king, by all means. So I don't see. So in this respect, I don't see a special case in what you just presented. Vice versa, if you look at what is really the case, like the concepts as such, of course they are different, but that clashes of hierarchies are commonplace in pre-modern societies who work on a state-based basis is not something we should wonder about. So you very much advocated colonial societies as very distinct these 300 years, and especially your cases, I don't see the big difference. I see them on the ground when it comes to piercings and things like that, of course, but for the all over the perspective we try to look for, I see a lot of similarities. Actually, a lot of similarity, and then the first question would be: Would you agree on that the difference in clashes of hierarchies would not be that strong? And the second question, to ambiguity, my English is not better than yours, probably. The ambiguity, thank you very much. That pops up every now and then, I know. First of all, it's a term coined by a psychologist, a female psychologist, I don't recall her name, in the 1920s, I think.
Yeah, that's ambiguity tolerance. This is a term.
Ambiguity tolerance, which is coined for radicals to like immunization against radical thinking, simple thinking, the Führer, things like that. I don't shy away, but to apply this here in a way in these contexts. And is this really a tolerance of ambiguity if I say you stay here and let them do their job like the Spanish king did with Diego, if I understood them right? So I give you a stipend, you stay here, and your brother is or half brother is going about his business. We all know that even at court, decisions are not really spelled out; they would just wither away. But that's a deal with. That's how they dealt with, I would say, and I would agree with you there, with consensus orientation. But in their mind, is that really ambiguity, and has it to do with tolerance? If you just leave a case like that and don't talk about it?
I didn't use the term tolerance.
No, all right.
Yeah, I'm just talking about
I'm trying to push you.
Ambiguity. I would argue that, the status of these three caciques is ambiguous in a way, because they've got their interpretation of what could mean Spanish overrule. We don't know, because we have no sources. Yeah, in this case, the only thing we've got are the Spanish sources and this painting. And I'm not an expert on that region either. Maybe anthropologists, archaeologists can tell us more about how these communities worked. But how they observed Spanish overrule, we don't know. And the Spaniards didn't want to know. For them, it was pretty fine if they appeared in Quito, pledged loyalty to the crown in a ritual framed context. They sent a painting to Madrid and the consensus facade was erected. So what was behind the facade? They definitely had a different interpretation of what rule, overrule, etc. meant than the Spaniards. And the Spaniards, in this case, really didn't want to make them accept their interpretation. It didn't matter, because it was a remote region, and what was more important is that, they helped castaways and they didn't ally with foreigners. So this kind of construction, for me, is ambiguous.
But what would you expect? I mean, they did fulfill all the demands. They obedeced. That was the king. They dressed fine. They stand there for portrait. I mean, what more could you ask as a governor in that region? What is behind what is going on in their heads is another story. Nobody knows. But where's the ambiguity? I can't get it actually. They just fulfill all the demands of the Spaniards and maybe all the demands of the local community, and they somehow get this together and fine. So I don't know.
Well, what they want is obedience to Spanish rule. What they want is that they get Christianized. That's why they send missionaries to the region, and the success of these missions is also very ambiguous. You can imagine. I mean, they build churches, they take Christian names, etc. But there are a lot of ritual practices that survive, etc., etc. And that's what I call ambiguity.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, Joan?
Thanks also for this talk. Just a very brief comment. Thomas and I talked about it yesterday. There is a book by Hilary von Thiesen about the age of ambiguity, which for him is the only modern period in Europe. I mean, I don't think he talked. Well, no, for him it's really a European thing without bothering much about the other parts of the world. And he thinks it's ambiguity and also a certain tolerance of ambiguity, this being a word from today, but then people knew how to live with this many aspects or many instances of ambiguity was a typical thing of the early modern time. And the critics he got with his interpretation is, and he said,
the non-ambiguity, I don't know what the name is, the clearness or the mono, I don't know the word which would be the opposite, is a modern thing, is an invention of Europe 19th, 20th century, which now we are leaving behind us as postmodern people. We start to see once again there is no clearness. We have, and the critics was that this is just a European. Now I mixed what Hillard says and what the critics said, but so this, that the exceptional is not the ambiguity, but the thinking that there could be a period without ambiguity, and that's a general idea of 19th, 20th century Europe, and that's wrong probably. That's just a discursive interpretation, and that the normal status is ambiguity. So not only for the early modern period, but for it's not very astonishing that we have it in Europe as well as in Latin America, as well as in the other continents and other periods.
Yeah, I mean, the concept arises in the 1920s and in psychology, but then it became famous because of, a professor of Islamic studies in Münster, Thomas Bauer, who states that it's a characteristic of Islam, this relatively high tolerance of ambiguity. And according to Bauer, Western modern societies can't deal with ambiguity. They want to disambiguate relations. They want clear-cut categories, or you're a Protestant or a Catholic, or you are, whatever, black and white, to put it very simple. And then there is a wonderful volume edited by Barbara Stolberg-Grillinger and Andreas Pietsch, who try to apply this concept on the so-called confessional age. So early modern Europe, the struggle between confessions, and according to Barbara Stolberg-Grillinger, and I pretty much agree with her, there is, on the one hand, this tendency to sharpen distinctions between the confessional groups. But if you look at the actors, what they do is they try to evade these clear-cut distinctions made by church authorities, etc. So it's a continuous process of disambiguation and ambiguity and dissimulation, etc. And according to Hillard von Thiessen, this is a general feature of the early modern period, or of what we in Europe call early modern period. And I think his book also has its flaws, and I'm not completely convinced, but if we are talking about categories, about characteristics of pre-modern societies, this could be another one. There is also a volume by two medievalists, is it Christiane Witthöft and Oliver Auge? Mm-hmm. And another one, I think. So this is also a concept discussed among medievalists, I guess.
Benjamin Schädler, huh? Georg?
Okay, since I just want to comment on the discussion about ambiguity, because I feel that the essay of Bauer muddied two concepts merged two concepts of ambiguity into each other. And when Franz talked about ambiguity, he meant one concept, and when you talked in your talk about ambiguity, you talked about another form of ambiguity. I think there are two forms. One form is the coexistence of different concepts or coexistence of different practices. This is what you described in your talk, if I understood you correctly, the coexistence of different concepts of rulership. And this is a form of ambiguity. Mm-hmm. There is another form of ambiguity, and I more or less interpreted what Franz said in this way: ambiguity as a muddying of concepts. though there is a clear concept, and ambiguity means this concept gets in some form muddied. Like, for instance, what is discussed in, Andreas said it, in medieval history were the conversos or Christiani Novelli, which are Jewish converts to Christianity, and Christian rulers up to a certain point tolerated them, and from a certain point onward in the 13th century they found them quite problematic because they muddied the distinction between Jewishness between Jewishness and Christianity, because they could not be put in one category or the other category, in between. And there's this concept of ambiguity as an in-between muddying of concepts, and then there's the concept of ambiguity of coexistence. I would say. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. But first of all, I guess that these two forms of ambiguity are connected. And, if you look at the mestizo problem, this is precisely what happens in colonial Latin America. These mestizos muddy the difference between españoles e indios. So they are not one thing and not the other thing. They are something in between.
If I may, I think we got 5 minutes left. I don't know if anybody else.
I've got another point. Please continue. No, but when you raised your first question, it was not only about ambiguity, it was also about the question whether, these clash of hierarchies was different from clashes between hierarchies in Europe. And this is an interesting question, and a question, maybe, there is another element that doesn't appear in Europe, and this is when the concept of race comes into play. So, on the one hand, of course, there is, especially in the early colonial period, this, up to a point, an acceptance of indigenous nobility, as we've heard already. And these nobles, as they come to the Spanish court, are treated like European nobles up to a point. But at the same time, there is an ongoing debate whether the inhabitants of the New World were humans. Does that happen in Europe?
You're looking at me, so maybe that was a question to me, right?
It was a rhetoric question.
Yeah, it was a rhetoric question.
Just say no, of course not.
Well, not in that respect, but going back to your mestizos, if I understood your talk right, the solution is quite simple. You build a new category, right?
It's a solution to certain problems, but not to all of them.
Which society has the solution of all its problems? There is a certain ambiguity there, probably. So I don't see. Of course, these societies are confronted with new problems, different problems. The only thing we suggest here is that solution, the path of the solution, is an old path, not only taken from Europe, but you can find these pathways building new categories. England, 1066, is that a colonial continent is colonized, if you wish, and they're building new categories. They even have new words for meat, for pork, and so forth. So, and nobody, with Ireland it's different, but with England after 1066, nobody would call it a colonized country, which is a bit as far as I'm aware. So is the question again? You're perfectly right. That's a new problem. They have to deal with it. The categories applied, the logic applied, so to speak, is a logic not foreign to pre-Columbian societies. Amazon Valley, we talked about that, but a lot of pre-Columbian societies, if I got it right. And it's not new for Europe, and it didn't break up until the 18th century. That's what I learned so far. Didn't break up until the 18th century, the logic that is applied in Europe and the logic that is applied in the colonies. So yes, there are new things, new problems that arise, but no, they don't find really new answers. And I mean, colonizing America is not something that is so strange. If you look at depopulation during the plague in European lands in the 14th and 15th century, and it invented new forms of dealing with death, for instance, but it didn't break up the society as a whole. To the contrary, they find their solutions according to the general rules, if I may say so. And ambiguity, I looked it up in the dictionary, there's no word for Duldung, I think.
Toleration. There's a difference between tolerance and toleration in English.
If that is the difference, I would very much want to distinguish between tolerance and toleration. Do they tolerate ambiguity, or is it a toleration of ambiguity, or is it tolerance? I mean, tolerance is
okay, that's where tolerance comes into play. Yeah. Okay, yeah, I see your point. No, I wouldn't talk of tolerance, not in the sense of an enlightened idea of tolerance. Of no. No, accepting ambiguity. Say, you know that things might be different, but you don't look too close.
Yeah,
and then things work. And this is something you can really observe. Yeah. I only had these two examples. My original plan was to introduce other examples. So I have an example of a German Protestant who comes to America and lives there almost 20 years and then gets into trouble with the Inquisition. And ambiguity worked fine during 20 years. And, then he commits a terrible error, which has nothing to do with religion. But this would be another story. I think we have to, differentiate two things. My problem with pre-modernity is simply that it overestimates, from my point of view, the continuities between these pre-Columbian societies and the colonial society. And I would argue whether you would call it modernity or not, this could be debated. Or when did Western modernity begin in Latin America? Around 1500? Around 1800? Or even later? I don't know. But I would argue that for the inhabitants of the Americas in the 16th century, there happened something that ever happened before. And you can't compare the devastation of the Caribbean islands with what happened with the plague in 14th century Europe. We are talking about eradication of a whole population. We are talking about an exchange. I mean, this is a problematic term nowadays, but historically speaking, an exchange of population in many places. So a place like Quito or like Tenochtitlan, Mexico, at the end of the 16th century has little to do with that place at the end of the 15th century. And this is simply a big difference. And this makes, in my eyes, the term pre-modern problematic if we look at Latin America. It may work in Asia, it may work in other parts, in other world regions, but for Latin America, it's a little bit difficult, at least from my point of view. But if we want to explain why colonial rule existed and worked quite well from the perspective of the metropolis, of course, why it persisted, this could be helpful. All these ideas that these forms of hierarchical organization of society were up to a point compatible, that these former structures could be integrated in this new structure, etc. And there, I would agree with you. So I don't know if that makes it clearer.
Different categories, I would say. Different criteria.
Yeah.